Welcome to A1TV, the Mark Show. Another great guest, another great interview with a wonderful person I met a few years ago through mutual friends, James Wiggins, and relived the rivalry. Garry Baker, welcome to A1TV. And where do I find you this morning, Garry?
Well, Mark, you and I do go back a long way. We didn't have a lot to do with one another years ago when we were both in the media back in the probably early 90s. But I've got a restaurant in Salamanca, a place called Rockwall Bar and Grill, one of those beautiful old sandstone buildings that is littered along Salamanca Place. And across the road from my restaurant is the old Silos building, which years ago were turned into some beautiful apartments. Now, I am currently sitting in a friend of mine's apartment on the 8th floor, overlooking the beautiful Hobart docks here where all the Sydney Hobart yachts all line up when they finish. And guess what? We're not in lockdown, mate. So we're having a ball here at the moment.
Good luck to you. Tasmania's a bit like that for sure. Now, we're going to talk about a lot of things during this interview, but I want to talk about where you're actually brought up in Meeniyan. Is that where you were brought up and that's where you played your first footy?
What happened, Mark, is that I was born and bred in Leongatha, which is the home of quite a few AFL players. In recent years, Jared Ruffhead was a Leongatha boy. Dyson Apple is a Leongatha boy. Stevie Wallace, who was captain of Footscray back in the 90s, whose son currently plays for the Bulldogs, is a Leongatha boy. And I was a Leongatha boy as well. But when I was 15, Mark, I couldn't get a game with Leongatha under 16s after dominating in 2 premierships in the under 14s. And if you've seen me play, mate, you know that I would have dominated in the under 14s. I got to the under 16s, mate, and I couldn't get a game with them for the whole year. So I started a trend back in the 60s, which I was apply the cross clubs. Now they do it all the time. It's a dime a dozen. They would have looked back on my history and said, well, if it was good enough for the big ball to do it, we're all going to do it. Now players change clubs in rugby league and all that. They change them every second day, like changing their undies. But in the early 60s, I left Leongatha because I couldn't get a game with the under 16s. I went out to a club called Meeniyan United. Now, Meeniyan is a little town about 5 minutes east of Leongatha on the way to Wilson's Promontory, and Dumbork is a little town that is in the hills from Meeniyan, about another 5 minutes. So back in the 50s and 60s, they both had separate football sides. And my father actually captain coached Dumbork back in the 50s. Anyway, they merged in the 60s. They were a bit of a front runner for mergers as well. So in the early 60s, they merged because they were both very small townships and become Meeniyan United, which is the side that I went out and played for. So I played 1 year in the under 16s. Then I played a year in, because back in those days, it was under 16s. And then you went into, if you were good enough, you played senior football with your club or you played in the reserves. There was no under 18s, no under 19s, none of that sort of stuff. At 16, if you were big enough and mature enough and good enough, you played senior footy. If you were big enough and mature enough and not quite good enough, you played in the reserves, or the seconds, as they used to call them in those days. I was big enough and good enough potentially, so I played every game in the seniors the following year as a 16-and-a-half-year-old. And then the following year I got drafted, well, it was recruited to Footscray Football Club, which was, in those days, it was zoning. All that area down there was, part of it was Footscray, part of it was Hawthorn. I was in the Footscray zone. So I got a couple of letters over there after I finished playing senior football, got a couple of letters from the great EJ Teddy Whitten, who was captain coach, or currently the coach of Footscray. Got a couple of letters from him to come down and train. So I went down there, spent the next 14 years playing VFL, stroke AFL footy.
Teddy Whitten's got a famous name in AFL, VFL circles. And just your first impressions of EJ and what your first impressions were of the big smoke, because it would have been a big move back then.
Mate, it was a massive move. Now, I was working as a brickies labourer, working for a guy that was an ex-footballer that loved the fact that I'd been picked up to go down to Footscray and have a run. So he used to run me down every Thursday. We used to knock off early Thursday. I'd go down and all the way to Footscray, which was about a 2.5-hour drive in those times. He had the V8 Falcon Utes. We'd pack up about 1 o'clock and I'd get me footy gear and down. We'd go down to Footscray and I'd actually train Thursday night. I was so wrapped in those days, mate, because they used to give me $15 check or a butt for $15 after training so that I could get some food on the way home. And it was my first first taste of getting paid to play footy, which I just couldn't believe that a football club was something that I actually really wanted to do, and I'd have done it for nothing, and I'd have paid to do it, was actually giving me a few dollars to have a meal on the way home. We did that for about 4 or 5 or 6 weeks until I played well enough in the reserves that they were going to put me on a long-term contract. But getting back to Teddy Whitten, I'd never forget the first time I walked into the change rooms. Now, if you can imagine Meeniyan United's change rooms, you get there, it was like, you know, a little old house in the 50s was the change rooms. And the old trainer that had the white overalls on would be in there when you get there, and he'd be lighting the little fire to light the hot water for the shower. And unless you got in there really early, you wouldn't get a hot shower. You had to have a cold shower. And of course, back in those days, every ground was muddy and wet, cold. And it's amazing how, you know, we're into the era we're in now, and you never see wet grounds or much rain at all. And back in those days, everything was muddy and wet. To leave Meeniyan United's rooms and to go to Footscray's rooms where they had a kicking net, every player had a locker. They had about 15 showers. It was all modern. They had about 8 baths, and after training, you'd see, you know, Gary Dempsey would be in the bath with David Thorpe and all these big name players. But the first time I walked into those rooms, I got there about 3 o'clock because I was as nervous as you could imagine. And I walked in, and little Georgie Bissett, who was a gun rover, a former Victorian player, and he come second in a Brownlow. I think he won a Brownlow one year, but he was one of the early players that got suspended and lost the Brownlow because of a suspension. He was a gun player. He was in there, and all I remember of Georgie Bissett was seeing him on the television on the black and white and having posters of him on the wall and all that sort of stuff. And to actually go in there and meet him, it was pretty hair-raising. And next minute, the door opened up, and in walked the great EJ Ted Whitten. And it was so surreal to see a bloke that was, if you put Wayne Carey, Gary Ablett, Tony Lockett into one, you would have got Ted Whitten. Honest to God, he was the biggest, strongest, biggest name person come out. He had a big chest, he had a suit on, he was an executive at Adidas, and he had a handshake, mate, that you would not believe. He grabbed me by the hand, and it was like he was Zorro. He basically used me as a whip. He was that strong. From that time on, every time I shook his hand, I always had to brace myself, otherwise you'd end up from one end of the room to the other. He was a powerful man, but he did it as a bit of a joke as well, or not as a joke, but just to let people know how strong he was, Teddy. I had a fair bit to do with him over the years, and when I would see him meet somebody, I would think to them, for God's sake, make sure you brace yourself, because you are not going to be standing in the same spot in a couple of seconds. And it was a bit of a thing to see him shake hands, but he was a massive man, a great man, and what a footballer he was.
Now, Garry, you spent 72, 73 at Footscray. Was he your coaches in that era?
Well, what happened, Mark, was it was 1971 that I went down there. I played the first couple of games with Meeniyan United and obviously played pretty well, and obviously got a letter. It was all letters in those days. Next minute you get this letter in the mail with Footscray Football Club, and it was so exciting to get that letter, and you'd open it up and it'd have, you know, we've been watching, keeping an eye on you, and we'd like you to come down and play on Saturday against Fitzroy at the Junction Oval. And the excitement was just off the show. So I went down there and played this game at Footscray against Fitzroy at the old Junction Oval, and Ted Whitten was actually the coach of the senior team in 1971, which was the year that I went down and played reserves. And I played 2 or 3 games and obviously played okay, so they signed me up for the rest of the year. And at the end of that year, Ted Whitten got sacked as coach of Footscray, because the previous year he was actually captain coach. In 1970 he was captain coach of Footscray, and obviously he was probably about 36 years old. He broke the league record. I think Dickie Reynolds held the record for 320 games, and Teddy actually, once he got to 321 games, they obviously nursed him through to break the record. It's amazing, you know, Dickie Reynolds was the only player that had played 300 odd. Now they're breaking 300 games every second weekend, players today, you know, because today's players, like back then there was 20 players in the team, there was 18 on the field and 2 on the bench. Today there's still 18 on the field, but there's 5 on the bench. Now half of these players are getting games today, and they're sitting on the bench as the medical sub, and they're not even getting a game. The games are all getting recorded. It's pretty unbelievable what's happening today. Whereas back in those days, you actually had to fight for a game. There was only 12 sides in those days. You had players from all around Australia wanting to go to the VFL because it was basically the AFL. So you had Polly Farmer and Cable and all the legendary players wanting to play VFL footy just like they do today. But there was only 12 teams and there was only 18 on the field and 2 on the bench. So it was hard to get a game back in those days. I played in 1971, I played the majority of the year in the reserve grade, which was a big thing to play reserves in those days. And then the following year, we went to Western Australia on a pre-season training camp, and Bobby Rose, a great Collingwood legend, he was appointed coach of Footscray in 1972. So I played under Ted Whitten in 71, Bobby Rose in 72 and 73, which was the 2 years that I played, the other 2 years that I played at the Bulldogs. I got a game, the first game of the year, because I got best on the ground in a practice game over in Western Australia. So the first game of the year, I got picked in the seniors for my first game. It was the most exciting thing that I'd ever, my parents, all my friends and all that. It was just crazy back in those days, being a little boy from Meeniyan, United. Anyway, I got a game. It was Des Tuddenham's first ever game as captain coach of Essendon. I'll never forget it. At the Western Oval, a bloke called Gary Merrington, who was a senior player at Footscray, when I ran out, he grabbed me by the arm, and what is now known, or was known as the Doug Hawkins wing, which was the other side of the ground from the E.J. Whitten stand, is where all the public sat, and I'd never forget, he grabbed me and he just said, run along here, up and down this, and just soak in the atmosphere, because the ground was chock-a-block full of supporters. And that was my first senior game. Unfortunately, we got beat by about 18 goals, and I got dropped after the first game. I had the one game, got dropped. And then the following week, playing in the reserves, I did my ankle and missed about 10 or 12 games with a bad ankle. So when I come back, I played the rest of the season in the reserves again. We qualified for the finals in the reserves, and I had a cracking final series. And back then it was only the top 4 or 5. So all the finals were played over 4 weeks back in those days. You had the first semi one Saturday, the second semi, the preliminary, and then the grand final. And in the reserves, by 3/4 time of the game that you were playing in the reserves, the MCG was chock-a-block. So there was 100,000 people there. So I remember playing this game against Carlton in a semi-final. We won the game. It was a semi-final, and I played a ripping game. And after the game, I was at work on the Monday, and I got a call from Melbourne Football Club saying, we watched play on the weekend. We'd like you to be our #1 ruck next year. So a few things sort of happened over the summer, and I ended up going to Melbourne and played there for 9 years and played 130 games odd, and ended up winning their best and fairest, and played for the state a couple of times. So I had a great time over there, but unfortunately never got the chocolates and played any finals. So I played 14 years altogether in the VFL scene. Had a great time, had a bit of success personally, but the ultimate success just wasn't ever there as far as playing in finals, and the ultimate thing was a grand final. But the funny thing was, every year at the start of the next year, we always thought we'd win the flag that year. We always had the belief that we could win the premiership, and that's how everyone was in those times. And even though you'd finish second or third bottom or whatever, we thought, well, next year's our year, because every player was a good player.
According to the records, Garry, was that you had Melbourne 1974 to 1981. There's one thing I want to ask you before we go on. The name Bull Baker. Everybody knows you as Bull. That your family call you Garry, but people know you as Bull. How did that name come about, Bull Baker?
Well, my father, who was an old footballer, he played in the VFA in the 40s, played a couple of games with Fitzroy in the reserves, and then went away in the Navy. And he was actually, in 1949, when he came back from the Navy, he was the first ever paid captain coach of Leongatha Football Club. So he went down there. That's why my parents were Melbourne people that went to live in Leongatha, because my father's football took him down there, and he was obviously getting more to captain coach Leongatha than what he was to play, whatever Fitzroy reserves or whatever he played. But he was only a young bloke, and when I come out a few years later, years went on, and he nicknamed me Bull. One time when I was a teenager, I thought, geez, I must have been a tough young kid to be called Bull and all that sort of stuff. And I called him Straubs. His nickname was Straubs. I never ever called him Dad. We had a great relationship, and we played in cricket premierships together. And he coached me in United the year before I went to Footscray, so I had a lot to do with sport with my father. We bowled in tandem. We took 9 wickets between us in the grand final to win a grand final in cricket one year when I was playing for Melbourne and he was in his 50s. 80s, and we had a great sporting time together. But one day I said to him, Straubs, I said, you know, people are asking me all the time how I got my nickname, and, you know, I must have been a tough young kid with big bloody broad shoulders and that to be called Bull. I said, what did I do for you to call me Bull? And he said, well, I'll tell you a little secret. I never wanted to tell you this. You were a lazy little kid when you were young. He said, you didn't start walking till you were nearly 2. He said, and what you used to do is you'd have your bottle or your dummy. He said, and if you dropped it and you were 2 years of age, and if it was a couple of feet away from you, normal kids would crawl over and get it. But you'd drop your dummy and you'd go, boo, like that. So you sounded like a bull because that's how you cried. He said, so I thought, I got to call this kid Bull. So he sort of cut me down a little bit then because I thought I was a big, tough, strong bloke. Because I was a bloody sook, that's why I was called Bull. The other nickname I had, Tony, was when I went to Footscray, one night there was Stephen Power, Gordon Casey and myself and another bloke called Harry Fry that opened the bowling for Queensland for a long time. He was a recruit from Maui and got suspended and took on cricket and ended up opening the bowling with Tomo for a lot of years and won a lot of Shield finals up there in Queensland. He was a good fella too, played a few games for Footscray. So there was Harry Fry, Gordon Casey, Stephen Power and myself, and we went out to the Tottenham Hotel one night and they had Johnny O'Keefe was playing there, and so we all went along, and pubs used to shut at 10 o'clock in those days. So we've all gone to the Tottenham Hotel, watched Johnny O'Keefe, and we got onto these couple of young lasses, and as we called them back in those days, and we went back to their house, and they lived in Braybrook, but they lived with their parents because everyone lived with their parents. So at 10:30, we've sort of crept into this house in Ballarat Road in Braybrook, and we're all very hungry, but we had to be really quiet because Mum and Dad were asleep in bed. So we've gone in there and we've sat down, we've had a cup of tea, and I said, I'm a bit hungry. And one of the girls said, well, what do you feel like to eat? And I've opened the pantry up, and there was a tin of Edgel's mushrooms there. And I said, I want to have mushies on toast. And then the other bloke said, oh, you having mushrooms? You like? I said, look, I'm from the country. I pick mushrooms all the time. I love mushrooms. Anyway, that was a Saturday night after a game. We've gone to training the next day. Everyone's calling me Mushy. So for 3 years of my life, the football world called me Mushy. Now, to this day, if I hear someone come in and see me somewhere and they say, hey, Mushy, it's just like I get called Bull, but it's in another era. And I know what era those people come from. And it's for those 3 years that I was at Footscray.
Now, we'll get back to your footy career, but when I was doing a bit of research about the number one Guernsey Bull, is that you had the number one Guernsey at your 3 clubs you play with, Melbourne, Footscray, Sydney. Was that ironic that was number one, or did you ask for number one, or how did that work?
Well, I didn't actually have number one at the Bulldogs. I had number 27 at the Bulldogs. When I played that senior game and I got dropped, following week we played Melbourne at the MCG, and I was a Melbourne supporter. All my junior days, I was a Melbourne supporter. And I actually played in the ruck the following week, the week that I did my ankle, and I played on Maxie Walker, who was obviously a great Tasmanian, a great test bowler, and he wore number one for Melbourne in 90-odd games. So I played on Maxie Walker, and this is not why I got number one, but I always think that the year before that I played at Melbourne, the guy I played on from Melbourne wore number one. He was a ruckman. He was a bit of a hero of mine as well because I love my cricket. I love Maxie Walker. I love watching him bowl. So anyway, the next year I've got there and Max decided to take on cricket and give up football. So the number one Guernsey was available, and it was worn the year before by a ruck. So they offered it to me, the number one jumper. And I love wearing the number one jumper at Melbourne. I wore it in 127 games for the Melbourne Demons. And when I went to the Swans, the jumper was available number one there, and they knew that I'd wore it the year before. So for 2 years, I wore the number one jumper at the Swans as well.
You did win a Bluey Truscott medal in 1978 as the best player at Melbourne Footy Club. But I'm curious about how the Sydney move come about when you went from Footscray to Sydney. It was about 82, I think, or 83.
When I won the best and fairest in 1978, I also represented the state in State of Origin. So I was the ruckman for the Victorian side, which was played at the end of the year in 1978. They played it the week after the grand final. It was a pretty enjoyable year I had in 1978, winning the best and fairest, getting picked to play state footy, playing with all those legends, Bruce Dool and Southby and Don Scott and all these blokes, to Michael Tuck, just to name a few. Well, you imagine the Victorian side, they were all legends. Well, at the time, I would never have put myself in the same bracket, but I suppose sometimes you've got to. And then the following year, first game in 1979, Carl Dittrich was appointed captain coach over the summer period. So me being the number one ruckman at Melbourne for years, all of a sudden, Carl Dittrich took over the number one ruck position. So I remember the following year, we played Footscray, which was my old side, at the MCG. Carl Dittrich has taken the first ruck. I'm in the forward pocket. And in those days, the forward pocket and the forward pocket ruckman and the ruckman used to change you'd work it out, we'll change every 8 minutes or whatever it was. So anyway, so Carl's in the ruck, the ball's come down, I've taken a mark, kicked a goal, right? The ball's gone back to the centre, a bit of a play's gone on, the ball's come down, taken a mark, kicked a goal. So at about the 6-minute mark, I've got 2 goals on the board against my old side, coming off a best and fairest year and all that sort of stuff. So next minute, Carl's waved the old put the hand up for me to swap. So I've gone into the centre bounce. There's a guy called Bluey Hampshire who's come from Geelong to go to Footscray, played a lot of great player, Bluey, played a lot of footy at the Bulldogs as well, become captain coach or coach Footscray years later. He's in the ruck. So the bouncer ball gone up and Bluey's kneed me in the bottom part of my knee, first bounce, and just ripped my cruciate in half. So basically that nearly finished my career. Ended up having a knee reconstruction, all that sort of stuff. By the time I got myself right, to cut a long story short, Melbourne had they've gone out and recruited Peter Moore and Kelvin Templeton in 1981 or 82 or whatever it was. So I was up against it because I'm coming back from knee reconstructions, all that sort of stuff. Plus I was hitting, I think I was 29 or 30 years of age. Peter Moore's, one of the guns of the competition. Templeton's one of the guns of the competition. So there was no spot for me in the Melbourne side. So it was a funny old thing because I played all the practice games and then we went to the Guernsey presentation night, which there was 1,000 people at this Guernsey presentation night, all the big names and the big noters and all that sort of stuff. And I've gone along there with the suit on and all that sort of stuff. Wore number one jumper, as we know. The whole night I'm sitting there, no Guernsey for the bull. No one told me. So I've gone along to this function to settle up for my 10th year at Melbourne, which was my 13th year in the VFL or 14th year. This is how professional we all were back in those days. No one told me I'd got the flick. So 2/3 of the way through the night, I thought to myself, well, you don't have to be Einstein to know that you wear number one. They're now delivering number 45 on stage and no one's told you. And also, because I went by myself to the night and I was sitting on a table with a few selectors and stuff, when I had a look around, I was actually sitting on the table by myself. So they'd realised that no one had told me, so they'd all gone to the toilet and left me standing there. So I just got up and walked out, and basically that was my time at Melbourne.
So then you had some time at Sydney, as you said, played 6 games, I think, in 83. But then you went into coaching, Garry, and Mordialloc and Moorabbin were 2 clubs. Did you always see yourself as a coach? And what sort of coach were you?
Well, I thought I was. Look, at that time, Ron Barassi actually, when they realised that they'd made a big blue, because I was a reasonably popular bloke around the club, so Barassi offered me the runner's job. Now, today, a runner's job, you probably, you might get 50 grand a year to be a runner. I don't know what. But back then it was, and I still thought I had a bit of football left in me to play. So I refused the runner's job for the Melbourne Footy Club. Sydney rang me, a mate of mine, Greg Miller, rang me, and Ricky Quaid, who I knew reasonably well. And the year before was the first year they were the Sydney Swans, so they needed maybe a bit of leadership up there. So they thought I'd fit the bill. So I went up there, played a few games in the first year, and then the second year that I was there, I actually captained the reserves, because in those days they were still playing out of Melbourne, you see. There was a squad in Sydney and there was a squad in Melbourne. There was some senior players used to live in Melbourne, train in Melbourne, fly up if the game was in Sydney. There was players in Sydney that never got a game, had to fly down to play in the second. So those first 2 or 3 years, players were actually passing one another in the air just to play footy. Some were flying from Melbourne to Sydney to play seniors or seconds and vice versa. So there was Warwick Capper and there was Ian Roberts and Rod Carter, and even Billy Picken was, based in Melbourne. There were some pretty good players based in Melbourne. Gary Frangalis and Barry Mitchell, who's the father of Tommy Mitchell. And there were some good players based in Melbourne. Warwick Capper was probably the biggest name of them all, although Barry Mitchell was a great player. Jamie Siddons, remember Jamie Siddons, that ended up making 15,000 runs for Victorian South Australia? Well, he was based in, he was a very good little footballer himself, and it was only because of a bad back that he chose cricket, but played with Jamie Siddons. So I had 2 years there, and then Edelstein come and took over, and they give Greg Miller the flick. Thought he wasn't flamboyant enough. So I thought, well, Greg Miller's looked after me, come to the Swans. Well, I'm going out with him. I wanted to be the big tough bloke and go to Greg. So anyway, I'd end up going down to Mordialloc as captain coach because I still wanted to play footy. I had a reasonably good year, won the best and fairest down there, so I was still playing okay. Then I went to Moorabbin because Mordialloc didn't pay me at the time, but they ended up settling a little bit later. So I thought, well, I'll go to Moorabbin, and a similar sort of thing happened there. But I just knew that those clubs are all, struggling financially. I was sort of, when you're captain coach those sort of clubs, you get involved with them a little bit on and off the field. So I sort of knew the scene. But at the end of my time at Moorabbin, I did think I could have been a VFL coach at the time. I think every player's got that in them, but I soon lost that. I come to Tassie and got into the hospitality instead.
Good segue too, Bull, is that we talk about Tasmania and about now, you and I love Tasmania, as people know, and you and I have had this conversation in the past about how you got to Tasmania. I want to tell the viewers how you got to Tasmania, because you played with a couple of clubs in Tassie. Sandy Bay was one, and there was another couple, or maybe one other club you played. So how did that transition from Melbourne to Tasmania go?
I was working as a sales rep in Melbourne, and obviously captain coaching those VFA clubs, which were in second division as well. And a mate of mine at the time was a captain coach in the Victorian Football League. He was a tough little player, and some people from Sandy Bay that I knew rang me up and wanted to know if I knew of a captain coach. Because whoever, I think Paul Sproul or someone had just, long story short, I put him onto this mate of mine who come over, captain coach Sandy Bay for a year, and then played with them for 2 or 3 years when Andy Bennett took over from him. But after his first year, he found this pub in Sandy Bay, and he rang me up to see if I wanted to go in partnership with him in the hotel. And because I was a sales rep, I'd lost the urge to go further with my coaching and all that, so I took him up on it. So I thought, I'll come down to Tassie, have a year down here, see what things are like. So I shifted down late 86 it was, and got into a pub with him. I ran the business with him for 12 months. Then I went out on my own, bought my own pub, and the rest is history. 35 years later, I'm not running pubs, but I've got a couple of restaurants down here. One is the one we spoke about earlier, Rockwall Bar and Grill, which is in the heart of Salamanca, and I've got another one out in a place called Meeniyan, which is about 5 minutes out of town in the northern suburbs, called what is it called, Mark? St Albie Bar and Grill, out in Meeniyan. So I've spent my last 30 years working in the hospitality. I still love it, not getting any easier with all what's going on in the world, but it's pretty safe over here and we're having a good time.
So what was a move that you thought with that last 6 months or 12 months has lasted 35 years, and people who've been to Tasmania, especially to Rockwall, and I've been in many times, if you have a chance to go to Tasmania, go to Hobart, make sure you go to Salamanca and the Rockwall Bar and Grill. It's a great little place. Your skill and your ability to connect with people, Garry, is something that obviously was inbuilt from a long, long way back. And what's the key to a good publican or a good hospitality person that tell the viewers about why you do what you do?
Well, when I was at school, which I wasn't there all that long, all I wanted to do was play footy when I was at school and play sport. And my father, as I said earlier, was a great old footballer and a cricketer. Well, at the time, he was a young footballer and cricketer. He played cricket until he was still playing cricket when he was in his late 50s, early 60s. When he went from Melbourne to Leongatha to captain coach, the Leongatha Footy Club got him a job as a welder in the local butter factory. So he was a welder forever and a day, and I used to go to the butter factory and watch him weld and all this sort of stuff. And then one day he decided he thought he would get into his own business because he was a people's person. He was wasting his people's personality on being a welder. So he bought the local service station and roadhouse. Now, back in the 60s, there was the service station and the roadhouse. So Mum was the roadhouse manager. My father ran the service station. So when I left school at 15, because I wasn't all that smart at school, I left school at 15. I worked for my father in the service station before I went brickies labouring, you see. And I used to watch my father absolutely look after his customers and treat them like we all want to be treated, and not in a bulldust way, but just in a good, solid, great to see you way. And I watched him do that for years and years. He wasn't successful as in made a fortune, but he was successful in himself because he treated people the way that we want to be treated ourselves. And I just took all that on. Obviously, it was embedded in me to do that sort of thing as well. So that's what I did. And I still do. When people come in, that's how I want to be treated. If I go to somewhere, I want the person to just say, "Hey, go on, mate, just sit down. We'll look after you. You just just leave it up to us type thing. And if everyone used all that sort of stuff, we'd all be successful in it. You go to some places somewhere and people don't really care too much about you, and they might survive as well. But when it's in you and it's no bull dust to do it all, I think it's great to make people feel completely at home. And what's happened now is 35 years ago, the customers that I had back in those days, I've still got their families to this day. And that's the great thing about it. I've still got people that I looked after that were uni students when I put my first pub on the map. They were uni students, 18-year-old. Now they're high-class lawyers. They bring their families in and their kids bring their families in, because it's just gone all the way down the track that they know that they're going to get looked after. And we've got that connection there as well.
You still get some of your old teammates come down. I mean, Hobart's a great place to visit. You still get your old teammates come in to say hello and g'day Bull and come in for a chat, blah, blah, blah?
Well, I do. Certainly it's dried up a bit the last couple of years. But I tell you, I've made some great friends out of people that I played against that I hated when I played against them. And they've come into the restaurant and now they're great. Like Ricky Barham's a great example of mine. Not that I ever hated him when he was a player, but you hate all opposition players. And Ricky Barham was a guy that I played against for years and never really knew him all that much. But from him coming to Tassie, certainly with his work as a football recruiter and all that, so they come into the restaurant, you become, how you going, all that. Now Ricky's a great mate of mine. It's amazing the friends that I've made out of football, since football, that, those sort of players, when you were playing against them, you thought you'd never be friends with them. And that sort of thing has really happened a lot over the years. Murray Rance is another one. I met Murray down here, who's the father of Alex. Murray Rance come in one night, one New Year's Eve, and I didn't know who he was when he come in. And I think the condition that he was in, he didn't know who he was either when he come in. But we ended up knowing, mentioning to one another what the connection was, and it was a Footscray connection. And that was 10 years ago. And now Murray and I are great friends. So that sort of thing has been fantastic. Other than that, Sam Kekovich, all the, John Elliott, they all come into the restaurant when they come to town. I think there's not too many would come to town that wouldn't come into the restaurant.
Garry, we'll finish off by saying that you're still competitive, because you and I catch up once a year, more than likely, with Relive the Rivalry, where you still lace up the boots and have a bit of a kick around or have a bit of a play around with some legends. A really good thing. You still can be competitive and play the game that you loved as a kid growing up. It's a really good thing you still do that.
Yeah, well, mate of ours, James Wiggins, he was a brainchild behind Relive the Rivalry about 10 years ago. I think this may be the 10th year of it. I was very nervous playing the first one. I think I was 59, and obviously I hadn't laced the boots up for quite a while when I was 59. And I remember all these Paul DiMartino and Paul Hudson and Acker and Favola and just to name a few, were all played, and a lot of them were just out of just playing. It's like two generations from when I played. Then there's a generation, and then they come along. So it's 2 or 3 generations with me watching these guys playing footy on television, winning premierships and winning Brownlows, and Wanganeen played and all these sort of blokes. So next minute I'm in the sheds at 59. I haven't played for 30 years at that level, so they wouldn't have known who I was. And I'm sure they'd be walking in saying, who's this old bloke over there in the corner pulling on thing. But all of a sudden the change room huff takes over, and next minute you're putting your ankle bandages on and pulling your boots on and getting a rub down, and you're thinking, how good's this? The smell of liniment and all that sort of stuff. And then to run out with those blokes, for me to say I ran out with Fev and Acker and a few of them, lots of those sort of guys, is just amazing. And I thought, anyway, 10 years later, I'm 60, I'll be 69 next birthday, and I'm still doing it. Well, last year I was 68 and did it. Hopefully I can do it this year at 69, because I think I'm one of only 1 or 2 players, Paul Hudson and maybe Simon and Paul. I think there's only the 4 of us have played every game. So, I hope to keep that record going. But looking forward to it this year down at Huonville. Love the camaraderie. Love the fact that I can still smell liniment before a game of footy, because you forget what it's like. You just forget that smell is something that is just so fantastic, and it just gives you a spur on, it's just terrific. And just to finish off, Mark, I jagged 4 last year, gave 3 away, so it wasn't bad for a 68-year-old.
You did well, Garry. And he's in the Huon this year, down in Huonville, and Relive the Rivalry is a great little concept in October this year. But if you're around the area, get on down and have a look at the game. But Garry, you look in really good health, and thanks for joining on A1TV, the Mark Show. It's another great guest, another great chat, and I'll see you soon, Garry, because it won't be long before I'm down there. So thanks very much.
Mate, I'll put your steak on for you, Cobber.
Thank you. Thanks, mate.